On a rain-soaked evening in March 1847, witnesses claimed they heard screams echoing from the Rutherford plantation, house that would haunt Spotsylvania County for generations. What began as a gentleman's poker game between tobacco planters ended in a wager so unthinkable, so morally devastating that local authorities buried every document related to the incident for over a century. The stakes weren't money or land, they were human lives. And when the final card was revealed, the consequences would ripple through Virginia's most powerful families, leaving behind a trail of mysterious deaths, financial ruin, and a conspiracy of silence that reached the highest levels of state government. Before we continue with the story of the Rutherford estate and the game that destroyed everything, before we dive deeper into this disturbing tale from Virginia's darkest chapter, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more shocking historical mysteries, and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow history lovers who aren't afraid of the darker truths. What happened that night would forever change how the wealthy plantation families of Spotsylvania County viewed each other, and more importantly, how they viewed themselves. Spotsylvania County in 1847 stood as one of Virginia's most prosperous tobacco regions, where vast plantations stretched along the Rappahannock River like green kingdoms, ruled by men who believed their wealth made them untouchable. The soil, enriched by decades of careful cultivation, produced some of the finest tobacco leaves in the American South, filling the coffers of families whose names appeared on bank charters, railroad companies, and political appointments throughout the Commonwealth. The Rutherford plantation, known locally as Thorngate Manor, commanded over 3,000 acres of this prime land. Colonel Harris on Rutherford had inherited the estate from his father, along with nearly 200 enslaved workers whose labor had built the family fortune over 3 generations. The main house, an imposing Georgian mansion with towering white columns and expansive verandas, sat atop a gentle hill overlooking the tobacco fields that stretched toward the horizon like an endless sea of green. Harrison Rutherford was 43 years old in the spring of 1847. A man whose success had been measured not just in acres and profit, but in his ability to maintain the delicate social networks that kept Virginia's plantation aristocracy functioning. He served on the county board, held shares in the Richmond and Rappahannock Railroad, and his opinions on tobacco prices could influence markets as far north as New York. But perhaps most importantly to Harrison, he was the father of Margaret Rutherford, 18 years old and considered by many to be the most beautiful young woman in 3 counties. Margaret possessed the refined education expected of a planter's daughter. She spoke French, played piano with remarkable skill, and could discuss literature with the sophistication that made her a sought-after guest at social gatherings throughout central Virginia. Her dark auburn hair and intelligent green eyes had already attracted marriage proposals from the sons of prominent families, though Harrison had been selective about which suitors he would even allow to call upon her. The Rutherford household also included Caesar Wellington, a man whose very existence challenged every assumption about slavery in antebellum Virginia. Caesar was 35 years old, born on the plantation, and had learned to read and write despite laws prohibiting such education for enslaved people. More remarkably, Caesar had developed an extraordinary talent for mathematics and what we might now call financial analysis. Harrison had discovered that his ability years earlier, and in a decision that scandalized some of his neighbors, had begun using Caesar to help manage the plantation's books and even advise on investment decisions. This arrangement had proven incredibly profitable for Harrison, but it had also created something unprecedented in their social order, a master who had come to depend intellectually on a man he legally owned. Caesar lived in better conditions than most enslaved people, occupying a small but comfortable room in the main house rather than the quarters, and Harrison often found himself seeking Caesar's counsel on matters that extended far beyond plantation management. The other key players in our story were Harrison's regular poker companions, men whose weekly games had become legendary among Spotsylvania County's elite. There was Judge Cornelius Petton, whose family had helped write Virginia's state constitution and whose legal decisions carried weight throughout the Commonwealth. Dr. Samuel Fitzgerald owned the largest plantation adjacent to Harrison's and served as the informal physician to most of the wealthy families in the area. Finally, there was Marcus Bogard, a newer addition to their circle, who had moved to Virginia from Charleston after inheriting significant holdings and whose reputation for high-stakes gambling was matched only by his skill at reading people's weaknesses. These four men had been meeting every Thursday evening for over 2 years, playing poker in Harrison's study while consuming the finest bourbon and cigars available. The stakes had gradually increased over time, moving from modest wages of a few dollars to games where hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars, changed hands in a single evening. But money, they all understood, was merely the surface of their real competition. These games were about power, about testing each other's resolve, about the psychological warfare that successful men wage among themselves. The social dynamics of 1847 Virginia created a perfect storm for what was about to unfold. The state's economy was showing signs of strain as tobacco prices fluctuated and Northern criticism of slavery intensified. Many plantation owners were quietly concerned about their long-term financial stability, though admitting such concerns publicly would have been social suicide. There was also growing tension about the expansion of slavery into new territories, with political debates that threatened to tear apart the very foundations of Southern society. The evening of March 18, 1847 began like any other Thursday at Thorngate Manor. Rain had been falling steadily since morning, creating a rhythmic drum beat against the tall windows of Harrison's study. The room itself embodied everything about Virginia plantation luxury. Mahogany furniture that gleamed in the lamplight, leather-bound books lining the walls, and a marble fireplace where seasoned oak logs crackled and hissed, casting dancing shadows across the Persian rug. Caesar had prepared the room as usual, arranging the poker table with its green felt surface, placing fresh decks of cards at Harrison's right hand, and ensuring that crystal decanters of bourbon and brandy were filled and ready. The enslaved man moved through these preparations with the quiet efficiency that had made him invaluable to Harrison, but those who knew him well might have noticed something different that evening. A tension in his movements, a way his eyes lingered on certain objects in the room. Judge Petton arrived first, shaking rain from his coat while complaining about the condition of the roads. At 62, he was the eldest of their group, a man whose legal mind had helped shape Virginia's response to various constitutional challenges over the past 2 decades. His presence at these games served as a sort of informal blessing. If Cornelius Petton was willing to gamble with you, it meant you had truly arrived in Virginia society. Dr. Fitzgerald came next, carrying his medical bag as well, always, since calls could come at any hour when dealing with the health needs of hundreds of people across multiple plantations. Samuel was known for his conservative playstyle and his ability to read physical tells in other players, skills that served him well both at the poker table and in diagnosing illnesses. Marcus Bogard was the last to arrive, and his entrance changed the atmosphere in the room immediately. At 39, Marcus possessed the kind of magnetic personality that drew people in while simultaneously making them slightly uncomfortable. He had been educated at the College of Charleston, spent several years in New Orleans learning what he called the gentleman's arts, and had returned to Virginia with enough wealth and connections to purchase significant holdings, though no one seemed entirely clear on the exact sources of his fortune. "Gentlemen," Marcus announced as he settled into his usual chair, "I hope you're prepared for a memorable evening. I've been feeling particularly fortunate lately." Harrison dealt the first hand while Caesar moved silently around the room, refilling glasses and ensuring the fire remained strong. The early games proceeded normally with modest pots and the usual conversation about tobacco prices, politics, and county gossip. But as the evening progressed and the bourbon began to take effect, something shifted in the room's dynamic. Marcus had been losing steadily for the first 2 hours, and those who knew his temperament recognized the signs of his growing frustration. He began making larger bets, trying to recover his losses through increasingly aggressive play. Judge Peyton folded early from most hands, content to watch the drama unfold between the other 3 players. Dr. Fitzgerald maintained his conservative approach, winning small pots consistently, but avoiding major confrontations. Harrison found himself holding unusually strong hands throughout the evening, and his confidence grew with each winning pot. By 10 o'clock, he was ahead by nearly $800, a substantial sum that represented several months of income for most Virginia families. It was then that Marcus made a suggestion that would forever change their lives. "Harrison, my friend," Marcus said, shuffling a fresh deck with the smooth movements of someone who had spent considerable time around gambling tables. "I'm growing tired of these small stakes. What do you say we make this evening truly interesting?" "What did you have in mind?" Harrison asked, though something in Marcus's tone made Caesar pause in his movement around the room. "I propose we play one final hand. Winner takes everything on the table." Plus, Marcus paused, letting the silence build. Tension, plus something more valuable than money. Judge Peyton leaned forward in his chair. "Marcus, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we each put up something that truly matters to us, something that would make this game memorable." Marcus's eyes glittered in the lamplight as he looked around the table. "I'll put up my Charleston properties, the rice plantation and the house on East Bay Street, worth over $15,000. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and the crackling fire. $15,000 was an enormous sum, enough to buy a substantial plantation or fund a small railroad. Dr. Fitzgerald shook his head. "Marcus, that's far beyond what any of us can match." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, Samuel," Marcus replied. "Each of you has something worth that much or more. You just haven't been thinking creatively enough." Harrison felt a strange excitement building in his chest. The bourbon, combined with his evening of successful play, had filled him with a sense of invincibility. "What did you have in mind, Marcus?" Judge Peyton could put up his legal practice and all the associated political connections. Dr. Fitzgerald could wager his medical practice and his plantation. "And you, Harrison?" Marcus's smile grew wider, though it never reached his eyes. "You could put up the thing that's truly most valuable to you, which would be your daughter's hand in marriage." The words hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Caesar, who had been refilling the brandy decanter, froze completely. Judge Peyton's face went pale, while Dr. Fitzgerald actually gasped audibly. Harrison's first instinct was to laugh, to dismiss the suggestion as the bourbon talking, but something about the way Marcus was looking at him, something about the challenge implicit in the suggestion, made him pause. In the social hierarchy of 1847 Virginia, a man's ability to control his family's destiny was considered a measure of his power. To refuse such a wager might be seen as weakness, as an admission that he wasn't confident in his own abilities. "Marcus," Judge Peyton said carefully, "you're suggesting something that goes far beyond gambling. A young woman's life shouldn't be wagered like property, isn't it?" Marcus asked. "Don't we already arrange marriages based on financial and social considerations? At least this way the decision would be made by skill rather than backroom negotiations." Harrison found himself actually considering the proposal, though a rational part of his mind screamed warnings. Margaret was indeed his most precious possession, beautiful, intelligent, and destined for a marriage that would strengthen the Rutherford family's position in Virginia society. But she was also 18 years old, and Harrison had ultimate legal authority over her future. The law was clear on this point. Fathers had the right to arrange their daughters' marriages as they saw fit. And if I were to agree to such terms, Harrison heard himself saying, "What would you put up to match such a stake?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, and for a moment his mask of southern gentility slipped entirely. What showed underneath was something harder, more calculating. "I would put up Caesar." The room erupted. Judge Peaton stood up so quickly his chair nearly toppled backward. Dr. Fitzgerald began to protest, but Marcus raised his hand for silence. "Think about it, Logitient. Callie, gentlemen. Caesar represents a significant financial asset, perhaps Harrison's most valuable single piece of property after the land itself. More importantly, Caesar possesses skills and knowledge that make him irreplaceable. Harrison depends on him in ways that go far beyond normal master-slave relationships. Losing Caesar would be devastating to the plantation's operations." Harrison stared at Marcus, realizing that the man had been observing their household dynamic far more carefully than anyone had suspected. It was true. Caesar had become indispensable not just to the plantation's financial management, but to Harrison's sense of intellectual equality. Their evening conversations about business strategy and investment opportunities had become one of Harrison's greatest pleasures. But there was something else in Marcus's proposal, something that made Harrison's blood run cold even as it excited him. By wagering Caesar, Marcus was essentially offering to give Harrison permanent ownership over another human being's exceptional abilities. If Harrison won, he would not only keep his daughter, but also gain complete control over Marcus' legal claim to Caesar, effectively doubling down on his investment in human property. Caesar himself stood motionless near the brandy table, his face carefully neutral, but his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the crystal decanter. Everyone in the room understood that they were discussing his fate as if he were an object, but the legal reality of 1847 Virginia made his opinion irrelevant. "Gentlemen," Harrison said finally, his voice steadier than he felt, "I believe we have the makings of a truly historic game." The decision to proceed with the wager created an atmosphere of tension so thick that even the crackling fire seemed muted. Judge Peaton had attempted one final protest, arguing that no game of chance should determine the fate of innocent lives. But Harrison's mind was made up. The combination of bourbon, competitive pride, and what he saw as an opportunity to assert ultimate dominance over his social circle had overridden his better judgment. Dr. Fitzgerald, despite his moral reservations, found himself drawn into the proceedings by sheer fascination with the psychological drama unfolding. As a man who had spent decades studying human nature through the lens of medical practice, he recognized that he was witnessing something unprecedented, a moment where the fundamental power structures of their society were being tested in the most personal possible way. Marcus began shuffling the cards with elaborate precision, his movements almost hypnotic in the lamplight. 5. Card stud, he announced. "One hand, winner takes all. Are we in agreement on the terms?" Harrison nodded, though his mouth had gone dry. "If I win, I keep Margaret and gain ownership of Caesar. If you win, you gain the right to marry. Margaret and I retain ownership of Caesar." "Precisely," Marcus confirmed. "Though I should mention one additional detail. Caesar will deal the cards." This suggestion sent another shock through the room. Having an enslaved person deal the cards for a game with such enormous stakes was virtually unheard of. But Marcus's reasoning was characteristically manipulative. Who better to ensure fairness than someone whose own fate hangs in the balance? Caesar has every incentive to deal honestly. Caesar's hands were visibly shaking as he took the deck from Marcus. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The man whose life was being wagered would be the one to determine the outcome. As Caesar moved to the head of the table, Harrison noticed something in the enslaved man's eyes that he had never seen before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of cold calculation. The cards were dealt with agonizing slowness. Caesar's movements were precise and deliberate, and Harrison found himself studying the man's face for any sign of manipulation, but Caesar's expression remained carefully neutral. his dark eyes focused entirely on the mechanics of the deal. Harrison's first card, dealt face down, was the 10 of hearts. His face-up card was the King of Spades, a strong start that sent a surge of confidence through his chest. Marcus received the Jack of Diamonds face-up while his whole card remained hidden. The second round of face-up cards gave Harrison the King of Hearts, a pair of kings showing. Marcus received the Queen of Diamonds, giving him a potential straight draw. The tension in the room became almost unbearable as the implications of each card became clear. "Pair of kings bets," Caesar announced, his voice barely above a whisper. Harrison pushed $500 into the center of the table, nearly half of his evening's winnings. Marcus matched the bet without hesitation, his eyes never leaving Harrison's face. The third face-up card was the moment that changed everything. Harrison received the 10 of spades, giving him 2 pair, kings and tens. It was a very strong hand, strong enough that Harrison felt his confidence soar. But Marcus received the 10 of diamonds, which combined with his Jack and Queen of diamonds suggested the possibility of a straight. 2 pair bets, Caesar announced. Harrison pushed the remainder of his money into the pot, over $300, and looked directly at Marcus. "Allen." Marcus smiled that cold smile again and matched the bet. Call, the final face-up card, sealed both men's fates. Harrison received the King of Clubs, giving him a full house, kings over tens. It was an extraordinarily strong hand, one that would win the vast majority of poker hands ever played. Harrison felt a surge of triumph so powerful that he nearly laughed out loud. But Marcus received the 9 of diamonds. With the Jack, Queen, and 10 of diamonds already showing, plus the 9 of diamonds, Marcus now had 4 cards to a straight flush. If his whole card was either the 8 of diamonds or the King of diamonds, he would have an unbeatable hand. The room fell completely silent. Even the rain seemed to have stopped, though later everyone would swear they could still hear it drumming against the windows. Judge Peyton was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Dr. Fitzgerald had stopped breathing altogether. Harrison stared at his own cards, trying to calculate the odds. A full house was an incredibly strong hand. The chances of Marcus holding exactly the card he needed were minimal, but the stakes were so enormous that even a small possibility felt terrifying. "Gentlemen," Caesar said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "it's time to reveal the whole cards." Harrison flipped his 10 of hearts, confirming his full house. "Kings over tens," he announced, though his voice cracked slightly. Marcus reached for his whole card with agonizing slowness. His fingers seemed to tremble as they touched the edge of the card. The entire room held its breath as he lifted it and turned it over. The 8 of diamonds. Marcus had a straight flush. 8 and 9's 10. Jack and Queen of diamonds. In poker, only a royal flush beats a straight flush, and Harrison was not holding a royal flush. The silence that followed was more profound than anything any of them had ever experienced. It was the silence of a world fundamentally changing, of assumptions being shattered, of consequences so vast they couldn't be immediately comprehended. Harrison stared at the cards as if they might somehow rearrange themselves. His full house, which moments before had seemed like a guaranteed victory, now felt like a cosmic joke. He had wagered his daughter's future on the turn of a single card, and he had lost. Marcus's voice, when it finally broke, the silence was soft, but carried absolute authority. "Gentlemen, I believe we have a winner." In the hours that followed the game's conclusion, the true magnitude of what had transpired began to sink in, like poison spreading through clear water. Harrison sat motionless at the poker tab, long after the other men had departed, staring at the cards that had sealed his daughter's fate. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in an eerie red glow that seemed appropriate for the hellish situation he had created. Caesar had remained in the room, standing near the window, where he could watch the rain continue its relentless assault on the Virginia countryside. The enslaved man's situation had become even more complex. While he had technically been wagered and lost, the legal realities meant that Marcus now owned him, but the practical realities meant he was still physically present at Thorngate Manor. The transfer of his ownership would require legal documents, and until those were prepared, he existed in a strange limbo. "Master Harrison," Caesar said finally, using the formal address that their private conversations had, long ago, abandoned. "What are you going to tell Miss Margaret?" Harrison looked up from the cards, and Caesar was shocked to see tears streaming down the older man's face. In all the years he had known Harrison Rutherford, through business crises and family deaths and economic uncertainties, he had never seen the man cry. "I don't know," Harrison whispered. "How do you tell your daughter that? You've gambled away her future to a man she's never even met socially." The legal implications were staggering. Under Virginia law, Harrison had absolute authority over Margaret's marriage until she turned 21 or married, whichever came first. His agreement to the poker wager was legally binding, assuming witnesses could be found to confirm the terms. Judge Peaton and Dr. Fitzgerald had both been present for the entire game, and their reputations made them unimpeachable witnesses, but the social implications were even more devastating. Word of the poker game would inevitably spread through Pennsylvania County's tight-knit plantation society, and the scandal would destroy not just Harrison's reputation but potentially the standing of everyone involved. The idea that a father would gamble with his daughter's life and lose challenged fundamental assumptions about paternal responsibility and social order. Marcus Bogard had departed that evening with a quietly satisfied air, promising to return the following day to discuss the practical arrangements of his victory. He had shaken Harrison's hand with what seemed like genuine sympathy, but there had been something triumphant in his eyes that suggested this outcome had been his goal from the very beginning. As dawn broke over Thorngate Manor, Harrison finally forced himself to leave the study and confront the impossible task of explaining the situation to Margaret. He found her in the morning room reading a book of poetry while taking her breakfast. She looked up as he entered and immediately noticed his haggarded appearance. "Papa, you look terrible. Were you up all night with your card game?" Harrison sat down across from his daughter, studying her face as if trying to memorize every detail. Margaret had inherited her mother's refined features, but combined them with an intelligence and strength of character that were entirely her own. At 18, she possessed the kind of beauty that would have guaranteed her a magnificent marriage to any of the prominent families in Virginia. Now, instead of choosing among suitable suitors, she would be bound to a man she barely knew. "Margaret," Harrison began, then stopped. "How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you tell someone that their entire future has been determined by the turn of a card? Papa, you're frightening me. What's wrong?" Harrison took a deep breath and began to explain the events of the previous evening. He tried to present the story in a way that emphasized his confidence in his hand, the reasonableness of the wager given the social customs of their time and the unfortunate but binding nature of the outcome. But as he spoke, he watched his daughter's expression change from sour confusion to disbelief to a kind of cold fury that reminded him uncomfortably of Marcus Bogard's calculating stare. When Harrison finished his explanation, Margaret sat in complete silence for several minutes. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated her orb and hair like fire, and Harrison found himself thinking that she had never looked more like her mother than at this moment. "Let me understand this correctly," Margaret said finally, her voice deadly calm. "You wagered my future marriage against the ownership of Caesar, and you lost." The hand was extraordinarily strong, Margaret. The odds of Marcus holding the exact card he needed were— "I don't care about the odds, Papa." Margaret's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. "You had no right to make such a wager regardless of how confident you felt. Harrison tried to explain the legal realities, the social customs that gave fathers ultimate authority over their daughters' marriages, the fact that most marriages in their social class were arranged for financial and political reasons anyway. But even as he spoke, he realized how hollow his arguments sounded. Margaret stood up from the table, her breakfast untouched. "When is Master Bogard coming to claim his prize?" The coldness in her voice when she said prize made Harrison WS. "This afternoon, most likely, we need to discuss the practical arrangements." "The practical arrangements," Margaret repeated. "How thoughtful of you both to consider the practical aspects of my bondage." She left the room without another word, and Harrison was left alone with the devastating realization that he had not only lost his daughter's future, but had likely destroyed their relationship forever. Marcus Bogard arrived at Thorngate Manor precisely at 2 o'clock that afternoon, dressed in his finest clothes and carrying himself with the air of a man who had achieved a significant victory. He was accompanied by a lawyer from Richmond, a thin, nervous man named Silas Crawford, who carried a leather satchel filled with legal documents.